to more light. Everyone, this is Professor Applewhite, and today I'm going to discuss Chapter 4 from your textbook. Chapter 4 involves um, really it's a discussion about society and social interaction. And so I am recording this lecture by video and also transcription. So please follow along. Um, I will make a space available on YouTube for you to comment uh, and ask questions if you have them regarding um, the lecture. So give me a couple of minutes and we will begin. Thank you. Okay, folks. So before we begin, I want to just start by giving you some brief announcements. The first is that I graded for your classes face-to-face and asynchronous. Assignments 1, 2, and 3 should be graded. Remember, assignment 1 was uh, uh, about the Peter Berger reading invitation of sociology. The second assignment had to do with the census. You had a selection, a choice to make between the census assignment related to your community or the assignment on W.E.B. Du Bois and his maps. And then your next assignment, right space assignment number 3, had to do with the lecture from chapter 3, where I asked some questions. I asked you to respond to the questions and upload it to Brightspace. And so this lecture will not be a required assignment. It will be an assignment that's based on extra credit, and those who want to participate will watch the lecture and do a small short assignment connected to it. Okay. So the one thing I do want to talk about are the assignments, the latest assignments that I've received. For the assignment regarding the census and the W.E.B. Du Bois assignment, for some students, I sent the assignment back immediately. If you did the census assignment and you did not look up your census tract information, I provided you a means to look up your census tract, right? We are not using zip codes and we're not using borough level data to look at like your community. I asked you to look up your census tract. So if you did not, if you wrote your paper and did not write about the census tract, I automatically sent the paper back and asked for you to resubmit. Okay. Um, in terms of the Du Bois assignment, I think some people didn't analyze enough maps, and I give like specific requirements in terms of how many maps I wanted you to look at. So I might have sent your assignment back and asked you to resubmit it if you did not look at the required amount of maps that I asked you to. One of the things that I've noticed is that, and there are 2 or 3 things that I've noticed, right? For the most part, people are following instructions and guidelines, but there are some students who are not following the instructions. really doing the assignment pretty haphazardly, not providing details, just not following the instructions. And when that happens, I'm automatically going to give you an unsatisfactory grade and ask you to do it over again. Um, and when I ask you to do that, you are going to get points deducted because I don't, I receive your paper, I'm reading it, you're not following my guidelines, I'd ask you to do it again. That gives you more time to do the assignment, but there has to be a penalty for you not following instructions or guidelines. So please be careful in the manner in which you submit assignments. It's okay if you don't understand something or you don't know, but just to do it like very haphazardly, not with details, not following instructions, that's going to give you an automatically unsatisfactory grade, okay? So if you got a paper sent back to you, if you got a 0 or a 50 on the assignment, it means that you need to resubmit the assignment. And I gave deadlines to people specifically regarding those assignments, okay? Um, in terms of the lecture assignment from chapter 3, I asked that people write down the full question and then respond to the question. And some people just didn't do that. And so if you didn't do that, I may have sent your assignment back and asked you to resubmit it. Okay. So we're going to move on from that. I just wanted to tell you that. Make sure you check your grades and the comments that I've left you for you regarding those assignments. Right now, I want to share with you the slides for chapter 4. Okay, so I'm sharing my slides with you right now. I'm going to put it in slide mode. Okay, so um, your textbook OpenStax Introduction to Sociology, chapter 4 is dedicated to a conversation about society and interaction. So, I just want to welcome everybody. And so, one of the things that we're going to focus on in this chapter is we're going to explore how societies are structured, how they change over time, and how we interact with them. It's something we constantly look at in sociology. Sociology teaches us that society isn't just something that we live in. It's something we constantly create and recreate through our daily interactions. Remember, I told you earlier in the semester that interaction is key when trying to understand or to study sociology. So when you think about society, what comes to mind? The economy, the government, religion, pop culture, or maybe your social media feed. Um, think about how platforms like TikTok or Instagram shape your behavior. The trends we follow, the opinions we share, even what we consider normal, all these come from society's influence. Okay, so consider how AI tools like ChatGPT, um, remote work, or even influencer culture are redefining how we connect and express ourselves. They show how technological changes are social changes, right? It alters our routines, our relationships, and our expectations. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to pause for a short minute, and then um, we'll start again. but at least you knew. Okay. Okay, we're back. Um, let's move forward a little bit. So right now, I want to start with this, start right here, because in your textbook, one of the things that the authors do is they try to break down like the origins of different societies, and so I want to talk a little bit about that, right? So um, I want to start by us talking about pre-industrial societies, right, as the foundation of human communities. Before the rise of cities, factories, or even social media, humans lived in small, close-knit communities, right? Sociologists identify several types of pre-industrial societies that represent a step in human development, okay? So we're going to go through these one by one as they're listed on this page, right? So the first one is hunter and gather societies. These are small nomadic groups that depend on wild plants and animals to survive. And you know, in my 1600 class, 1603 class, we talked a little bit about this. They are highly egalitarian, right? And we talked about the reasons why. No one owns much and everyone contributes. Well, why? Because in order to survive during this time, you had to cooperate with one another, right? So modern parallels include remote indigenous communities or people choosing to live off the grid, um, and these type of lifestyles as a critique of modern consumerism, right? Think of the survivalist YouTube channels or eco collective movements, right? Okay, so we're talking about hunter and gathering societies. All of the ones that are listed are pre-industrial societies, so I want you to be mindful of that. The next one I want to talk about is pastoral or pastoral societies. And these rely on the domestication of animals, right? Um, they often emerge in dry regions, right? Where farming is difficult. Modern examples include the Maasai herders in East Africa, or even virtual economies in video games like Stardew Valley or Animal Crossings. Some of you may be familiar with those. They stimulate pastoral exchange and social cooperation, right? So the domestication of animals means that you no longer have to be nomadic, right? uh, you can now kind of control animals and use them for your sustenance or your survival. Okay, the next one we want to talk about is horticultural societies. And these type of societies rely on cultivating small crops, using hand tools. They are semi-nomadic, but settled. They're more settled than the hunter-gatherer societies. Think of community gardens and urban farming projects in cities like Detroit or in Harlem. Down the street from where I live, we have a community garden, and they harvest it right about this time of the year. Um, it's modern people using horticulture for sustainability and social connection, right? The last part I'm talking about in a modern sense, but horticultural societies existed within the pre-industrial period. Okay, the next one we want to talk about is agricultural societies, and you said it right here. Okay. Agricultural societies represent the dawn of civilization. Large-scale farming required irrigation, plows, and animal labor, and sometimes human labor, right? Leading to permanent settlements, to cities, and social hierarchies, right? And social hierarchies is a ranking within society because everyone has like these division of labor in terms of tasks, right? Um, Gender inequality intensifies during this period. Men are often control the land, while um, women's work became devalued, right? And we talked a little bit about this in one of my classes, how women's work was relegated or domestic labor was relegated. I mean, seen as less valuable within society. Um, Modern reflections of this include the factory farming and global food systems, right? And they show how we were still independent on agricultural foundations, though now driven by corporate power. rather than community labor. If you see some of the things that have been going on, especially as it relates to ICE and immigration, we do rely on agricultural labor, right? And we see this in how some immigrants have been targeted by ICE, and it has affected the farming community, their ability to harvest crops, plant crops, and in turn, it's affected the larger society. Okay, so like we're talking about agricultural societies as pre-industrial, but like even today, we some components of our society are agricultural, and we do rely on it for as a food source. The next thing we want to talk about is feudal systems or feudal societies. And these were structured by rigid hierarchies. We talked about this at the beginning of this course, where we had owners, often these were the lords, and laborers who were the serfs or peasants. The power was tied to the land. Today's equivalent, some argue like that the digital economy mirrors feudalism. In my 1603 class, we talked a little bit about this, right? Um, how big tech companies, right, digital lords control platforms and users or digital serfs provide free labor through data. And I talked exactly about that. Like I talked about the idea in our 1603, my 4 p.m. class, how as a user, you give access to all of your information, right? Your content, right? But you don't have control over the content. So you can make that kind of comparison with like the lords and the serfs back during a feudal time in the pre-industrial period. Okay. Um, Now we're going to move on to industrial societies. Okay. We're going to talk about industrial societies. Before we talked about pre-industrial societies. Now we're going to talk about industrial societies. Okay. So, um, the Industrial Revolution of the 1700s and the 1800s marked a massive transformation in the way people lived, right? Um, Steam power, mechanized production, and urbanization changed how people lived and worked. It changed their entire way of life, right? People were farmers, they lived on the land, they relied on the land, and now, because of industrialization, their lives had changed. People moved from farms to cities, forming new social classes, the industrial working class, and the rise of factories, right? Meant work became more specialized, but also more alienating, right? And we talked a little bit about this in one of my classes, right? Like that people were doing more specialized work because they're longer doing farming, but it becomes more alienated, or people become separated or alienated from their labor, right? Marx called this alienation. Right, workers had lose connection to the products of their own labor. Remember, we talked about in one of my earlier classes that at least when people were peasants or they were farmers, that they produced the things that they needed to survive, and they had control over how much they produce, what they produce, etc. Well, Marx makes the argument that like once you like start working in factories, you become alienated from your own labor, right? You don't have control over any of your labor at all, right? You cannot control what you make, right? That's controlled by the bourgeoisie or the factory owners. You don't control how much you make. That's controlled by the bourgeoisie or the factory owners. And you don't control the pace in which you make it. Um, and you get paid a wage for your labor, as opposed to owning all the products of your labor, right? Yielding the products of your labor. So Marx said this was a real problem. He described it as alienation. And if you think about companies today like Amazon, right, where warehouse employees or Tesla factory workers, right, the technology boosts efficiency, but it can isolate workers from their own labor and from the meaning of labor, the meaning of work. Okay. Industrialization also spurred major social change. It not only changed like the lives of workers and the workplace, it just it brought about major social change, right? Labor unions, public education, and social reforms all emerged to address the inequalities it created. Industrialization, right? It created all of this inequalities, and so all of these things came about because of these social changes, right? Labor unions, public education, social reform. Cities like Manchester, Detroit, and Chicago became symbols of progress and exploitation, right? Chicago had like in the early 1900s, it was one of the major producers of meat in the country. They had a lot of slaughterhouses where meat was produced or processed, but at the same time, many people lost their lives. It was like a dangerous and unhealthy work, right? And so industrialization brought social changes, good and bad. A cultural parallel that you could look at and that the authors talk about. There's a film. I don't know if you like old films. This is a silent film. It's called Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, and it shows you like it kind of like one of the major themes of it is around the assembly line. An assembly line is like something. Some of you guys have probably seen it. Maybe I could put something in the video, but like it's basically like when you stand in place and like there's a line of products come down this assembly belt and you just do one thing in the whole process of making something. So if you were making chairs, you probably put the glue on. So then the next person would put the leg on the chair, right? But you'd be putting glue on and on and on. That's the only thing you would do, right? Well, what does that do for you as a human being, right? Like you only have one task. That's it. You don't have to use your brain. You don't have to do anything. And so places like Chicago and Detroit, Manchester, and a lot of other cities became the symbols of like this kind of work, right? And exploitation. And this film, Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin, really like talks about like automation and how it like dehumanizes us, and you can make a comparison today about automation, like that happens, for example, in Amazon factories, and also AI, right? That echo the same concerns that Charlie Chaplin talked about in his film. And are we optimizing life or are we mechanizing it? In other words, like is our lives becoming better as a result of this type of work? Um, or is it just like mechanizing our work and it's like removing us or like detaching us from our own labor and ourselves? And so that those are some of the things that the authors talk about. Those are some of the things that Marx talks about. Okay. Let's take a brief break and we'll come back. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about all of this. Okay. So as you see, some here are some of the major changes that took place that I talked about and I summarized. Take some time to look over them. Sociology also emerged during this time because sociology came about to try to address all these tremendous changes that were happening in the world as a result of industrialization and urbanization, or the movement from people from farms or agricultural way of life to an urban way of life. Okay, let's pause for a minute and we'll come back. Some more. All right, this is not bad. Okay, my apologies. I thought I had stopped. thought I'd stopped sharing, but anyway. Let's continue on, okay? So, we were talking about the industrial period, um, right? And so we talked about some of the changes that came about. The last thing I mentioned was that we saw the emergence of sociology to address some of the changes that were taking place in society at this time. Um, right. So these are the major things we want to consider or to think about in terms of major changes as a result of the industrial age. Right. And then after that, right, so despite you know, so despite all these changes that took place, right? Like what we start to see is this change in society, both good and bad, right? And so the period we want to talk about after the industrial society is a post-industrial society. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so post-industrial societies, they emerge um, in the mid to late 20th century or like 1950 onward up until like 2000, right? And this is also considered like the digital revolution, right? Where we see economies shifting again, right? The first shift that we saw was from an pre-industrial economies or pre-industrial societies to an industrial society, right? And then from an industrial society, we see a shift to a post-industrial society, right? Instead of producing goods, societies begin to produce information, okay, and services. And we call this in sociology, we call this a post-industrial or an information-based society. Post-industrial or an information-based society, okay? So the defining feature in this type of society, in an information-based society, or a digital society is knowledge, right? So tech workers, educators, analysts, and influencers drive these economies. Um, they access to data rather than ownership of land determines power. I'll say that again. Access to data rather than ownership of land determines power. Think again about what we talked about in class for those who were I was face to face with in terms of owning a company like Facebook, owning a company like Amazon, owning a company like TikTok, right? All these people are giving their user content, right? But really, who owns that content? The people who own that content are the people who own the company, right? And they have access to your data, and that's what gives them power. It's not about land necessarily. So consider Silicon Valley, right? Apple, Google, and Meta shape how we work, communicate, and even how we think, right? And we saw that in the 2016 election where, bots were being put out and shaping how people thought about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Um, so cultural influence now travels digitally, right? K-pop fandoms, online activism, and cryptocurrency communities all exist beyond geography. It all exists digitally. So it's based on information. Um, But inequality still exists, right? There's a growing divide between those with digital access and those without. We call this the digital divide. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed this when millions of students struggle to attend school online. Some of you may have struggled to attend school online because you didn't have a computer at home or you didn't have access to a computer, etc. Okay. And so um, when we talk about this inequality, we talk about digital divide. This is what comes about in a digitally based or an information based economy. And what it means is that even people who are able to achieve something in those kind of economies have to have skills that are related to information or data, right? So that digital divide not only prevents people from having access to information, but it also prevents people from gaining the kind of work that they will need in the 21st century. Okay. So some examples, if you've ever seen the show Black Mirror, this show, Black Mirror, highlights both the utopian and dystopian sides of the digital society. Okay. Utopia means like, where everything kind of comes together and everything is good. And dystopian means like a dark, dismal, or like the end of society. Okay. And so if you've ever seen Black Mirror, a lot of the shows have to do with technology and information and how information is used. And in the comments, I'll share some of my favorite episodes of Black Mirror. And they have some great episodes that really sort of address like the concerns of like what happens when our lives are taken over by technology, by information. There's one episode where, everyone in society, they are like sort of connected to this rating system. And so everything you do is being rated. And it's all, it's kind of like when you like things online or whatever. But what happens if every aspect of your life is being rated? Right? If when you come to class, right? You come in 2 minutes later, and I give you a rating based on that, right? This is like the type of thing that we face in an information-based society, right? And you think, oh, we're so far removed from it, but don't you do the same thing when you give ratings for or food reviews or reviews for professors or reviews for a hotel you stayed? It's the same thing. It's user driven. It's based on information. Okay, so we got to think about the positive and the negative aspects of that, especially as we interface within society, we interact within society. Okay, let's go on. So let's talk a little bit about Emil Durkheim. We talked about him in chapters 1 and 2, but we'll talk a little more about him here. Okay. So Durkheim saw society as an organism, okay, like the body, right? Each part playing a major role in maintaining stability, right? And he introduced the concept of the collective conscious, conscience, or awareness. That's what conscious means, right? So he talked about the concept of collective consciousness, shared values, and the beliefs that unite people. So when you think about the beliefs that unite people, right? It might be religion, it might be values, it could be beliefs around education, about child rearing, etc. Right? In pre-industrial societies, um, uh, Durkheim argued that societies were held together by mechanical solidarity. Right, right. In other words, people had similar lifestyles, shared religion, and a strong sense of family ties, right? It's mechanical. It's like there's not a lot of deviation. Everybody shares the same values. They have strong family ties. They have similar lifestyles, right? Think of rural communities today where everyone knows each other, right? Everyone knows each other's families. People's norms are very similar, etc. That's what Durkheim would use to describe mechanical solidarity. Okay. However, he argues that like as societies become more advanced, if they as they become more industrial and more post-industrial, he says that they rely on organic solidarity, right? And so organic solidarity is the argument that we're bound by interdependence, that each person has a specific role that they have to play. Um, and you may not know your barista personally, but your life depends on their labor and vice versa. Or your sanitation worker. You may not know them, but like your life relies on like your sanitation worker, whether they come pick up the garbage, et cetera, et cetera. And that was Durkheim's argument. What do you think about that? What do you think about this idea of organic solidarity? So when shared values collapse, according to Durkheim, he called it anomie or normlessness, a state of normlessness. Okay, and we saw this during the pandemic, right? And periods of social unrest where people question institutions and meaning. Okay, so this is a theory he argues around mechanical solidarity, organic solidarity, and collective consciousness. Do you agree with him? What parts make sense and what parts don't. It's a theory, right? So it's a proposition about how something works. In this case, how society works and how the members of society, right? So in terms of like, we can think about his theory in terms of like the collective mourning and solidarity after tragic events like George Floyd or 9/11, or even the shooting of Charlie Kirk a couple of weeks ago, right? Um, what these things show us is how social integration strengthens societies, even around grief, right? Even if you don't agree, well, okay. So I want you to think a little bit about his terms. It's important that you know all of these terms and how they work, okay? Okay, let's go on. The next person we want to talk about is Karl Marx. So Marx believed that economic conflict drives all social change, right? Whereas Durkheim believed like solidarity and collective consciousness bring society together. I'm sorry, Marx believed that economic conflict drives all social change. Society, he said, is divided by the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. We talked about this a little bit before. In the 21st century, the conflict plays out through the gig economy, right? Uber drivers, food carriers like DoorDash and Uber Eats, right? Freelancers like on Fiverr, for example, people without benefits or security, right? Health benefits or job security, right? Corporations hold the means of digital production. I talked a little bit about this earlier, right? They control the apps, the algorithms, and the platforms, right? Um, so Marx's idea of alienation remains relevant. Workers often feel detached from the products they make or the goals of their labor, right? Or the fruits of their labor. And false consciousness, believing that the system works for you when it doesn't, right? And a lot of people suffer from false consciousness. Um, is reinforced through the media, advertising, and influencer culture promoting the illusion of equal opportunity. Tell me, I want you to take a look at the definition of false consciousness and give me examples of false consciousness that exists today, right? Um, and you can put that in the comment section, okay? Well, what is class consciousness? Class consciousness is an awareness of what's happening on a class level. And class consciousness is growing, right? Through labor movements, social movements, and some examples are the unionization of Starbucks and Amazon. And online campaigns like Fight for 15. In other words, what this is saying is like when people come together collectively and think about the things that like are working against their own class interests, right? Like if you work at a job and it doesn't give you healthcare benefits, if you work at a job and you don't get a fair wage for your labor, um, class consciousness, this is what Marx describes as class consciousness, having awareness of the class that you are part of and the needs of that class, right? So for example, I'll give you a perfect example. Like years ago, this may be about 10, 12 years ago, and that right now it's actually coming up as an issue. Um, President Barack Obama was trying to pass the Affordable Health Care Act, right? And Affordable Health Care Act, and his belief was would be to allow people who didn't have health insurance to get access to health care insurance. Okay. Um, at the time when he was trying to pass the bill, 42 million, or no, 46 million Americans did not have health care insurance. Okay. Yet and still, these people who didn't have health care insurance, um, some of them voted against and spoke out against the Affordable Health Care Act that President Obama was trying to pass his policy. He ended up passing it, right? But if you don't have health care insurance, um, you're voting against like a bill that would provide you with health care insurance, so you wouldn't be burdened with high healthcare costs, or if you became ill, like that you would be able to get treatment, or if something happened and you had to go in a hospital, you wouldn't be burdened with like high excessive bills because you had insurance. But some people who were poor, low income, did not want to see the Affordable Health Care Act pass. That's false consciousness. So I want you to think of some other examples of false consciousness, and I also want you to think of some examples of class consciousness besides the ones that I've provided to you. Okay, I'll give you a few minutes to do that um, shortly. Right. Another example. I don't know if some of you have seen this movie, but the movie is called Paradise. I can't. I mean, I'm sorry, Parasite. Can't go into it a lot, but it came out in 2019. It won the Oscar for Best Film, and it dramatizes the class struggle. It like the wealthy and the poor literally live above and below each other in this film. You got to check it out. It's a Korean film. It won Best Picture. It's a great film. I think it can be found on Netflix and a few other channels. Okay, so we're gonna pause here and then I'll come right back. Okay, thank you. I'm tired. I'm tired. I'm tired. I'm tired. I'm tired. I'm tired. I know. Thank God. Okay, we're back. Now let's talk a little bit about Max Weber. Okay, this is a figure from the section on Karl Marx. It shows you how Marx believed that society was structured, right? The superstructure. If you look at the ones that are listed, those are the social institutions that we talked about, and then at the base was the economy, right? So the base shapes like the social structure, the superstructure, I'm sorry, or like the social institutions, the economy, right? So think if you instead of putting like the economy here, put like agricultural economy and think about the ways that the agricultural economy affected the government, the family, religion, education, etc. Then you could put an industrial economy. Well, how did that affect the government, family, religion, education, culture? And so I think I want you to do this, right? As a part of your exercise, as a part of your assignment, I want you to think about the three different economies: pre-industrial, um, industrial, and then post-industrial or information-based economy, and then tell me how the superstructure is impacted by those different economies. Okay, you should put that into your assignment. I think what we'll do is have this as a structured assignment that you'll post on Brightspace for extra credit. Okay. All right. Let's move on. So here's a picture of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. Marx is on the left, Engels is on the right, and they analyze differences in social power between the have and the have-nots. And then here's some other examples that your authors give you. So an assembly line worker, right? Install car installs car parts with the aid of complex machinery. Has technology made the type of labor more or less alienated? You can answer that question also in your assignment. So let's talk about Max Weber now, right? Let's go on to Max Weber. So Weber was concerned about the growing rationalization of a society or replacing tradition with efficiency and logic, right? So rather than a human being doing the work in this picture, Weber would say like that his labor could be done by like a robot, right? Because it was more efficient and logic, based on his argument. And he argued that um, he was worried about like efficiency and logic replacing human labor, right? He warned of the iron cage where individuals are trapped by bureaucracies, institutions, and expectations. So tell me, right? He makes this he compares it to an iron cage, right? And he says that human beings will be like trapped by this iron cage. Give me examples of how human beings might be trapped by either bureaucracy, institutions, and expectations. Okay, give me an example in your assignment. Those are the definitions of rationalization and the iron cage. Okay. Think about, for example, automated grading systems, AI job interviews, or like constant optimization of productivity, right? They save time, but also reduce creativity and human works, right? So I think about the times when I call customer service for like, DMV or, I've ordered something online on Amazon or, and I'm trying to get it resolved and I get an AI, right? At the hotel I'm staying at right now, um, the reception person is an AI person, not a real person, right? So I have to go through this AI representative, and they can never fully answer my question creatively because they only have like a certain script that they can answer to. So half the times when I call, they end up putting me onto a real person, right? So these are the kind of limitation. This is, the cage that Weber describes. Okay. I want you to give me examples, not the ones that I've used, right? Um, One thing that comes to mind, when I think about the iron cage rationalization and the things that Faber was concerned about is the television show The Office, right? It really captures the tension between um, employees trapped in like bureaucratic like absurdities, right? Like it's just so absurd, like the things that happens on that show. But workers are trapped in it. So you give me your own examples of the iron cage and like how it affects like human behavior. Okay. Weber questions remains, can modern society balance efficiency with humanity? Right. Even in my field, people want to go to like having like sort of robotic teaching or whatever. And like, does that replace humanity? Can it do the same job? And not just in the work that I do, but in the work that a lot of us are doing. And with for you all, a lot of work that you will you will have the option of doing will be shaped by this. Okay, so let's go on a little more. That's Weber. You should know all three of these sociologists, right? We talked about this before. So here's an example of cubicles. Cubicles are designed to maximize workspace, but it also can be limiting, isolating, and may be logical, but it may, right? So think about that. If you've ever worked at a cubicle, you may know how it feels. It can be very isolating, right? Um, okay. And so we're gonna tackle, this is the next part. We're gonna tackle the final part of this chapter. We're gonna talk about um interaction, okay? Or the idea of like who are we? What roles do we play in society? And according to sociologists, we construct reality through our interactions with others. And in a way, our day-to-day interactions are like those of actors on stage. And we'll talk a little more about this. We'll talk about this in depth, okay? So, what we're talking about is the social construction of reality. And sociologist Peter Berger, you actually read some of Peter Berger's work earlier, and Thomas Luckman, right, proposed that we build a social reality through our shared meaning. Okay, so we agree that the sky is blue. We agree that you know, that water is liquid, right? Those are things that we kind of agree on because we have shared meaning. They argue that reality isn't fixed. Okay, it's negotiated through interaction, that reality isn't fixed, that it's negotiated through interaction. What do you think of that? I want you to write your response in your assignment, okay? So if we're going to talk about these, we want to talk about the Thomas theorem, okay? And the Thomas theorem argues or says if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Okay, I'll repeat it. If people define situations as real, then they are real in their consequences. So when enough people believe something like social media trends, conspiracy theories, or cultural norms, it becomes real in its effects. I want you to think of examples where the Thomas theorem applies. Like something became real because people made it real. They made it a reality, right? One example is the online influencers like Little Maquela or AI generated models. will have millions of followers, even though they aren't human. Their impact on fashion, politics, and identity is very real. So it becomes real, like even though this is like a real thing, right? An AI generated, right? But it becomes real. In short, society is a performance according from this point of view, right? And like actors, we all have roles, we all have scripts, and we have audiences, right? Right now, I'm performing a role. There's expectations that go with it. I have a script that I have to follow, right? This is the argument of, in terms of like the social construction of reality, okay? Um, so you should know all of these terms, be familiar with them. So now we're going to talk about role, status, and the presentation of self. Okay, so we occupy a multitude of social positions, right? Each with its own expectations, right? So according to Weber, status is like it refers to your rank in society, while roles describe how you should act that status out. I'll say that again. Um, Status refers to your rank in society, while roles describe how you act that status out. I know the words look different from what I said. They mean the same thing, right? And so we also want to talk about ascribed status versus achieved status. Ascribed status are the things that you're born into, like your race, your gender, or your nationality. Whereas achieved status is something that you are, or a status that you earn, right? Like a college degree, a job title, or a social reputation. When roles overlap or conflict, we experience role strain. That word strain, right? It's too much expected from one role, right? You have a strain from like meeting the expectations of each one of the roles. Or role conflict when two roles can't clash. Think about the working mom, right? Mom, we have expectations about mothers, right? But also there might be expectations of her as a worker, right? Um, and that can cause a clash or conflict. For example, a student working full time faces conflicting demands between like their work and school. I've seen some of you experience this with even within my class. Um, and so if you've ever watched the show Insecure with Lisa, Issa Rae on HBO, Issa Rae's character constantly balances professional ambitions, right? Friendships and her love life, illustrating how status and roles shape modern identity. Okay. So let's go on a little more. Let's talk about, you can read that on your own. It really talks about self-fulfilling prophecy and the story of Oedipus, right? If you know that story, you should read this. Oedipus, like, there's an oracle that tells Oedipus that he's gonna, and this is like Greek mythology, that he's gonna murder his father and marry his mother. He does all these things to avoid like this fate and ends up meeting it in the end, right? But because he fulfills it by really trying to avoid it. It's this idea of like the social construction of reality, right? Um, so take a look at that as an example. Here's another example of role strain or role conflict. Here's a mother trying to do work and she has two kids, right? Has these two roles that she has to meet and the expectations that go along with them, one as a worker and one as like a mother, and it can cause strain, right? Or conflict. Role performance is how a person expresses the role, right? And so we should talk about Charles Cooley, right, and his idea around the looking glass self. Um, the looking glass self suggests that we form identity by imagining how others perceive us. If you know what a looking glass is, it's kind of like a mirror. And so Cooley makes the argument is that like um, we have our self or our identity is formed as a result of how we perceive others or see us, right? Or how we look in the eyes of others. What do you think about that idea? Does it hold? It's a theory. Do you think that theory holds in terms of how the identity or ourselves is formed, right? I want you to comment or write about that in your assignment. So, for example, um, this idea has exploded in relevance during the social media period era that we're living in now. So every like or comment reinforces or challenges our sense of self, right? Young people in particular perform identity online for visibility and validation, right? It was different when I was growing up. Like maybe you had to perform like who you are when you went to school or whatever, but like when you're online, there's another level of performance that you have to do. Do you agree with what Cooley says about the looking glass self and identity, or do you disagree? If you agree, tell me why. If you disagree, tell me why, and give me examples. So a show, I like to use television shows as examples. If you ever seen the show Euphoria, Rue and her peers, right, are constantly negotiating identity under the gaze of social media and their peers, right? So how do we construct a sense of self when everyone's performing for an audience? I want you to answer that question. How do we construct a sense of self when we're all performing for an audience? Okay. So here we are to the conclusions. Let me get to the conclusions, right? Today we see how sociology helps us connect the past and present from hunting and gathering societies to digital ones. The key takeaway is that society is dynamic, shaped by technology, economics, and interaction. So here's the things that I want you to reflect on in the final parts of this lecture, okay? How do social structures influence your choices and opportunities? How do you in turn influence society through your work, your posts, your purchases, or relationships? And so understanding society means recognizing our own role in constructing and changing it. Thank you guys for your time. This will be posted and an assignment will be posted to accompany this video lecture. Again, this is optional. You don't have to do it. If you want to do it, you do it for extra credit. Thank you for your time and have a good day.